NATO foreign ministers met in Prague at the end of May 2024 and agreed to allow the limited use of Western-donated weapons against targets inside Russia. The agreement was less than what France, the United Kingdom and Ukraine wanted, but it was a significant escalation in the war. Russian President Vladimir Putin vowed retaliation against the West, but did not specify what the retaliation would be. Since then, Russia has dispatched warships to conduct missile drills off the US coast, while en route to Cuba, threatening to consider the United States a direct combatant in the war. This came after Ukraine fired US missiles in Crimea, resulting in the deaths of 4 people, including 2 children, and the wounding of 150 others in a widely publicized media campaign against the United States. The most concerning Russian action that appears to escalate is President Putin's state visit to North Korea on June 19, 2024, and the agreements that followed. Although the agreement's specifics remain unreleased, there are several concerning indications of its existence. The first was an apparent mutual defense treaty that both countries signed. The agreement's press release declares that both countries will promptly provide military assistance to each other in the event of an attack. The treaty reinstates a 1961 defense clause that North Korea and the Soviet Union maintained until the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991. It also mentions cooperation in investment, trade, science and technology. President Putin said that the agreement does not rule out developing military and technical cooperation with North Korea. The West heavily sanctions both countries, and this agreement between the nations will counter any new sanctions and circumvent the current ones. It is expected that Russia will use its veto power in the United Nations Security Council to prevent any new sanctions from being imposed on North Korea, as demonstrated when it vetoed the renewal of a United Nations agency assigned to monitor international sanctions compliance against North Korea. The UN Security Council presented evidence of North Korean ballistic missile debris in Ukraine as proof of sanctions violations by Russia and North Korea, and Russia is expected to use its veto power to prevent any punitive actions against itself or North Korea. Another issue arising from the agreements is the question of what designates an attack. Is this treaty retroactive and applicable to the war in Ukraine? Will targets inside Russia use Western-donated weapons to trigger this defense pact? President Putin addressed this question after leaving North Korea on his way to Vietnam by stating, "It needs to be additionally studied, but it is close to it." This is an intentionally ambiguous statement, but it suggests that this defense pact is retaliation for the NATO weapons decision. This agreement led to another significant decision. South Korean media, quoting government sources, stated that North Korea will deploy up to 4 army engineering brigades to parts of the occupied Donbas in exchange for direct financial payments from Russia. Although not intended for use in combat, these brigades will operate in disputed regions within Ukraine. This will allow Russian personnel to be directed to other areas of the front, potentially deterring Ukraine from escalating the war and causing North Korean casualties. We have yet to determine whether attacks on Russia's borders by Western or Ukrainian weapons will alter the size and scope of North Korean operations in Ukraine as part of the defense agreement. North Korea has touted the alliance as justified, specifically mentioning NATO's reach-out and partnership with the Indo-Pacific 4 nations, or IP4 of Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, as well as the newly formalized cooperation between the US, Japan and South Korea to counter the North Korean missile program. In addition to affecting the Ukraine war, the alliance could affect Korean Peninsula and Japanese security. Russia has pledged to supply North Korea with advanced weapons, thereby enhancing the lethality of their threat. The Russians have stated that they would have the same stipulations on their weapons given to North Korea as the West has on the weapons it donates to Ukraine. This implies that the agreement's clause directly responds to NATO countries' decision to permit the use of their weapons against Russian targets. This decision raises concerns as it presumes North Korea can sell these Russian weapons on the global market to any regime it desires, potentially leading to destabilization in various regions of the world. It is doubtful if Russia can support the transfer of weapons to North Korea, while it is under sanctions and short on sophisticated electronics. Russia is now a net importer of military equipment, including from North Korea, so it's unlikely that it has enough weapons to make this threat a reality in the short term. Russia does have the option to provide technology transfers, satellite support and advisors to help North Korea improve the development of its domestic weapons program. This would most likely be preferable to North Korea and its huge philosophy of self-reliance. With Russian assistance, North Korea can perfect and operationalize its newest solid rock-fueled ICBM, Hwasong-18, which can reach the US because it is a solid rocket-fueled missile. it can be considered a first-strike weapon. Russia can also aid in nuclear warhead miniaturization and re-entry, as well as navigation and weapon targeting. The concern is that with apparent Russian support, the North Koreans could have the capability to threaten the US mainland with a nuclear attack if it comes to the aid of Japan or South Korea. There has been a long-standing concern that the United States might withdraw from any conflict, be it in Europe or Asia, if it faced nuclear weapons from a power that did not pose an existential threat. This is an exaggerated apprehension, as the US could face blackmail for other policies from the same state if it decides to retreat from the threat. Despite this, there are elements within Japan and South Korea that share this concern, which could lead to a debate about a domestic nuclear weapons program and a potential regional nuclear arms race. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol condemned the agreement as a threat to his country's security and a violation of UN resolutions. The president declared that this agreement harms South Korean-Russian relations, prompting his country to take action. South Korea has provided financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but it has not sent any weapons. South Korea stated that it would review this decision and consider sending arms directly to Ukraine as a response to the new pact. President Putin said this would lead to retaliation against South Korea, and he stated that South Korea has nothing to fear from this pact if it does not attack North Korea. South Korea and North Korea are technically at war, so it is an intentionally absurd statement by Putin that South Korea should not be concerned about his country's treaty with North Korea. It is uncertain how China views this Russian initiative, as Russia visited North Korea and Vietnam in the same week and signed several agreements in a region that it considers its sphere of influence. China has been much more reserved in supporting the North Koreans with sophisticated weapons or nuclear and missile programs, and now Russia is subverting Chinese policy. China is also in a territorial dispute with Vietnam in the South China Sea, so Russia is complicating China's position. Will this draw Russia and China closer together or create friction? Or will China accept Russia's position as part of a larger struggle with the West? The West's decision to permit the use of donated weapons against Russian targets has led to Russian threats, including nuclear threats, and this poses additional threats to the West besides the Russian-North Korean agreements. This new defense agreement appears to have the greatest potential to cause a widening war in Europe or a defensive realignment in the Western Pacific. The conflict in Ukraine is in its third year, and it appears that both sides are desperate to get the upper hand in the war, and this desperation leads to escalation and increased international volatility.